In the rolling hills of medieval Europe, where the morning mist clung to stone walls like a sleepy cat refusing to wake up there, lived some of the most peculiar people in human history. These weren't warriors or merchants or even particularly exciting individuals. They were monks who had voluntarily given up one of humanity's most basic pleasures, the simple joy of complaining about the weather. The year was 1098, and a rather serious fellow named Robert of Molesme had just founded the Cistercian order. Robert had looked around at the existing monasteries and decided they were far too chatty for his liking. Imagine going to a library and thinking it needed to be quieter. That was essentially Robert's approach to monastery life. The Cistercians, as they came to be known, took the concept of silence so seriously that they made mime artists look like chatterboxes. But here's where it gets interesting. They didn't just decide to be quiet for a few hours a day, like a particularly strict library. Oh no, that would be far too reasonable. They committed to years, sometimes decades, of barely speaking at all. Now you might wonder how exactly one survives without the basic human need to say, "Pass the salt," or "Your haircut looks terrible, Brother Benedict." The answer lies in one of history's most elaborate and ridiculous communication systems ever devised by people who clearly had too much time on their hands. The Cistercian sign language wasn't just a few simple gestures. It was a complex, sophisticated system that would make modern sign language interpreters weep with admiration. These monks developed over 300 different hand signals, each more specific than the last. They had separate signs for good bread, mediocre bread, and bread that Brother Francis made again, God help us all. Brother Thomas of Canterbury, a monk who joined the order in 1156, kept a secret diary that somehow survived the centuries. In it, he wrote about his first encounter with monastic sign language. He described watching two older monks have what appeared to be an intense argument about turnips, conducted entirely through increasingly frantic hand gestures. The argument lasted 47 minutes and ended with one monk storming off to pray, leaving the other monk standing alone in the vegetable garden, still making angry turnip-related hand signals at thin air. The beauty of this system was its incredible specificity. The monks didn't just have a sign for water, they had different signs for water for drinking, water for washing, water for baptizing, and water that Brother Jerome spilled again because he has the coordination of a newborn giraffe. This level of detail suggests that medieval monks were either incredibly organized or incredibly petty, possibly both. Learning this sign language was no simple task. New monks called novices would spend months memorizing hundreds of gestures. They had to learn the difference between the sign for "I need to confess something minor" and "I need to confess something that might get me excommunicated." Getting these two mixed up could lead to some very awkward conversations with the abbot. The training process was both rigorous and ridiculous. Senior monks would test novices by having them order imaginary meals using only hand signals. Picture a grown man frantically gesturing at thin air, trying to communicate that he would like some fish but not the fish from Tuesday, because that fish was suspicious, and could he please have some of the good bread, not the bread that Brother Marcus made, because Brother Marcus clearly learned baking from someone who had never seen bread before. But the monks didn't stop at just hand signals. Oh no, that would be far too simple for people who had already committed to a life of voluntary silence. They developed a whole range of non-verbal communication methods that would make a modern mime jealous. They used facial expressions so subtle that they could convey 17 different types of religious disappointment with just a slight adjustment of their eyebrows. They also mastered the art of meaningful looks. A single glance could communicate, "Brother Peter is stealing extra porridge again." "The abbot is in a bad mood because his arthritis is acting up." Or, "I think Brother William might be possessed by demons, but it's probably just indigestion." These looks were so precise that monks could have entire conversations across a crowded chapel without making a sound. The most impressive part of their communication system was how they handled emergencies. They developed a series of urgent gestures that could quickly communicate everything from "the kitchen is on fire" to "Vikings are approaching" to "Brother Francis is trying to brew beer again, and we all know how that ended last time." These emergency signals were practiced regularly like medieval fire drills conducted by people who had taken a vow of silence. The daily routine of the silent monk was like watching a very slow, very religious ballet performed by people who had forgotten how to use their voices. Every morning at 4 a.m., when most sensible people were still dreaming about things that weren't turnips and hand gestures, the monks would rise for their first prayer service. This was called Lauds, which sounds much more impressive than getting up ridiculously early to mumble prayers in Latin. The wake-up process itself was a marvel of silent efficiency. One monk, designated as the knocker, would walk through the dormitory, gently tapping each sleeping brother on the shoulder. This monk had to be chosen carefully because waking up someone who had taken a vow of silence required a delicate touch. Too gentle, and Brother Augustine would sleep through the apocalypse. Too firm, and Brother Benedict would assume the Vikings had finally arrived and start making the emergency hand signals for "hide the good wine." After waking up, the monks would dress in complete silence. This might sound simple, but consider that medieval clothing was essentially a puzzle designed by someone who had never actually worn clothes. Robes had to be arranged just so belts had to be tied in specific ways, and hoods had to be positioned at the exact angle that said, "I am pious," rather than "I am plotting something involving the monastery chickens." The morning prayers were conducted in what can only be described as aggressive whispering. The monks weren't completely silent during religious services, but they spoke so quietly that they made librarians sound like rock concert announcers. They chanted in Latin, which was convenient because most of them didn't really understand what they were saying anyway. This led to some amusing incidents where monks would accidentally chant grocery lists or complaints about the weather, confident that God would understand their intent, if not their actual words. Breakfast was perhaps the most challenging meal of the day for silent monks. Imagine trying to communicate your dietary preferences without words to someone who has also forgotten how to speak. The monks developed an elaborate system of breakfast-related gestures that would make ordering at a modern coffee shop look simple. They had specific signs for, "I would like porridge, but not the lumpy kind that Brother Francis makes. Could I have some of that bread, assuming it wasn't baked by Brother Marcus? And is there any chance we could have something that doesn't taste like it was prepared by someone who learned cooking from a book written by people who had never seen food?" The monastery kitchen during breakfast time looked like a very slow, very religious dance performance. Monks would glide silently between tables, making subtle hand gestures to indicate their needs. The kitchen monks, who had the unenviable job of interpreting these requests, developed an almost supernatural ability to understand what their brothers wanted. They could tell the difference between the gesture for "more porridge, please" and "this porridge tastes like it was made from sawdust and disappointment," with just a glance. But the real challenge came during work time. Medieval monasteries were essentially self-sufficient communities, which meant that monks had to do everything from farming to brewing to copying manuscripts. All of this had to be accomplished with minimal verbal communication, leading to some of the most elaborate non-verbal project management systems in human history. The monastery gardens were particularly amusing to observe. Picture a group of grown men trying to coordinate planting schedules using only hand gestures and meaningful looks. The head gardener, usually an older monk with decades of experience in silent horticulture, would assign tasks through a complex series of pointing, nodding, and what can only be described as interpretive dance. New monks often spent their first few weeks accidentally planting turnips, where the carrots were supposed to go, simply because they had confused the hand signal for root vegetable orange variety with root vegetable disappointing variety. The brewing operation was even more complex. Medieval monasteries were famous for their beer, which was safer to drink than water, and significantly more enjoyable than listening to Brother Jerome's theories about why the chickens were plotting against him. The brewing monks had developed a sophisticated system of gestures that could communicate everything from "the barley is ready" to "Brother Francis has been sampling the product again and is currently trying to teach the monastery cat to sing hymns." Manuscript copying, or scribal work as the monks called it when they were feeling fancy, presented its own unique challenges. Monks would spend hours, hunched over parchment, carefully copying religious texts by hand. This work required intense concentration and absolute silence, which suited the Cistercians perfectly. However, it also required occasional communication between scribes, leading to the development of what historians now call scholarly sign language. This specialized form of communication included gestures for "I need more ink," "This parchment is terrible," "Brother Matthew is copying too slowly again," and "I think I just made a mistake that's going to require starting this entire page over, and I'm having thoughts that are definitely not appropriate for a man of God." The head scribe, usually the most patient monk in the monastery, would patrol the scriptorium, making subtle corrections and offering silent encouragement through a complex system of approving nods and disappointed headshakes. The most challenging aspect of monastic sign language was dealing with visitors. Medieval monasteries regularly received guests from traveling merchants to local nobles to other monks from different orders. These visitors, being normal people who hadn't voluntarily given up the use of their voices, would arrive expecting normal human conversation. The monks had to develop a whole separate set of gestures for dealing with outsiders, including the universal sign for "We have taken a vow of silence, but we're not being rude. We're just committed to this lifestyle choice that probably seems insane to you." The afternoon hours in a silent monastery were when things got truly interesting, because this was when the monks had to deal with what modern people would recognize as customer service. Medieval monasteries weren't just places of worship. They were also hotels, hospitals, schools, and sometimes the only source of decent beer for miles around. All of these services had to be provided by people who had voluntarily given up the ability to say, "How may I help you today?" The monastery guest house was a particular source of entertainment for anyone who enjoyed watching elaborate pantomime performances. When travelers arrived seeking shelter, they would be greeted by a monk who would attempt to communicate availability, mealtimes, and house rules through an increasingly frantic series of gestures. Brother William of Newminster, who served as guest master at Rievaulx Abbey for 37 years, became legendary for his ability to convey complex hospitality information without uttering a word. Brother William had perfected what other monks called the welcoming dance, a graceful series of movements that could communicate. "Welcome to our monastery. We have beds available. Dinner is at sunset. Please don't steal anything. And if you're here to cause trouble, Brother Francis is bigger than he looks and surprisingly good with a wooden staff." New guests often stood in bewildered silence as Brother William performed this elaborate welcome routine, unsure whether they were being greeted or blessed or possibly cursed in a very polite way. The monastery infirmary presented even greater challenges. Medieval medicine was already a questionable science practiced by people who thought that bloodletting was a reasonable response to most ailments. When you added the complication of doctors who couldn't speak, medical consultations became exercises in creative interpretation that would have impressed professional mime artists. Brother Anselm, the infirmarian at Fountains Abbey, developed a diagnostic system based entirely on pointing and facial expressions. He could identify common ailments through a series of questions that patients answered by nodding or shaking their heads. His examination technique involved a lot of pointing at various body parts while making questioning faces, leading to consultations that looked like very serious games of charades where the stakes were someone's actual health. The real comedy came when Brother Anselm had to explain treatments to patients. Medieval medicine involved a lot of unpleasant procedures, and explaining why someone needed to drink a mixture of herbs that tasted like liquid regret required considerable non-verbal skill. Brother Anselm would demonstrate treatments on himself, leading to scenes where a grown monk would pretend to drink imaginary medicine while making exaggerated faces to indicate whether it would taste good or terrible. Spoiler alert, it was almost always terrible. The monastery school was another source of silent chaos. Medieval monasteries were among the few places where people could learn to read and write, which meant that silent monks had to teach young boys who had not taken vows of silence and saw no reason to stop talking just because their teachers couldn't respond verbally. The result was classrooms where one person was trying to conduct lessons through elaborate hand gestures while 20 children chattered away like medieval podcasters. Brother Gregory, who taught at Mellifont Abbey for over 2 decades, developed what he called the pointing method of education. He would point at letters, then at students, then at letters again, hoping that eventually the connection would become clear. His Latin lessons involved a lot of dramatic pointing at words while making faces that were supposed to convey grammatical concepts. Teaching the subjunctive mood through facial expressions alone was considered one of the great pedagogical challenges of the medieval period. The monastery library was perhaps the only place where the vow of silence actually made sense. Libraries are supposed to be quiet, so silent monks were naturally suited to library work. However, medieval libraries were also places where monks came to research, study, and occasionally argue about theological points that seemed incredibly important at the time, but would strike modern people as debates about how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. Brother Thomas, the librarian at Clairvaux Abbey, had to develop a system for helping researchers find books without being able to ask what they were looking for. He created an elaborate catalogue system based on hand gestures where different finger positions indicated different subjects. The gesture for theology was different from the gesture for philosophy, which was different from the gesture for that book Brother Jerome wrote about why he thinks the monastery chickens are plotting against him, which we keep for entertainment purposes only. Research consultations in the monastery library looked like very scholarly games of charades. A monk would approach Brother Thomas and begin making gestures indicating the type of book he needed. Brother Thomas would respond with counter gestures trying to narrow down the request. These conversations could go on for 20 minutes with both participants making increasingly elaborate hand movements until they either found the right book or gave up in mutual exhaustion. The copying work in the scriptorium continued throughout the afternoon, but this was when the real challenges emerged. Morning copying was relatively straightforward, but afternoon fatigue led to mistakes, and mistakes in manuscript copying were serious business. When a scribe realized he had made an error, he had to communicate this to the head scribe without disrupting the work of dozens of other monks who were trying to concentrate on their own copying. The protocol for reporting copying errors was almost ritualistic in its complexity. The monk who had made the mistake would first catch the attention of the head scribe through a series of subtle gestures that indicated, "I have made an error and require assistance." The head scribe would then approach and examine the work, after which he would indicate through facial expressions whether the error was minor enough to correct or serious enough to require starting the entire page over. The latter decision was communicated through what other monks called the face of doom, an expression so universally understood that it needed no translation. Afternoon chores in the silent monastery weren't just about books and gardens. They included all the little things that kept the place running, like laundry, candle making, and keeping Brother Francis away from the cheese cellar. Laundry day was a spectacle of its own. Imagine a group of monks, each with their own pile of robes, trying to negotiate washing schedules using nothing but hand signals and the occasional exasperated sigh. The sign for "that's my robe, not yours" was so frequently used that some monks could do it with their eyes closed. Candle making was another group activity that brought out the best and sometimes the worst in monastic sign language. Beeswax was precious, and the process required coordination. One monk would melt the wax, another would dip the wicks, and a third would inevitably get distracted and start sculpting tiny wax animals instead of candles. The head candle maker developed a whole series of gestures for stop playing with the wax. That's not how you dip a wick, and if you make one more wax chicken, you're on dish duty for a week. As the sun drifted lower in the sky, preparations for Vespers began. This evening prayer service was a highlight of the monastic day, not because it was particularly exciting, but because it meant dinner was near. The monks would file into the chapel, each one moving with the quiet confidence of someone who knows exactly how many steps it takes to get from their seat to the altar without tripping over their own robe. The only sound was the soft shuffle of sandals and the occasional stomach rumble, which was universally understood as the sign for, "I hope Brother Marcus didn't cook tonight." Dinner itself was a masterclass in silent dining etiquette. The monks ate together in a large hall seated at long wooden tables. The meal was simple bread, cheese, maybe some stew if the garden had been generous. Conversation, of course, was forbidden, but that didn't stop the monks from communicating. They had developed a whole range of dining gestures: a tap on the table for "please pass the salt," a subtle wave for "more bread, please," and a gentle nudge for "you have something green stuck in your teeth." The most coveted seat was always next to Brother Peter, who was famous for his ability to carve cheese with the precision of a master sculptor. Occasionally, a monk would forget himself and start to speak, only to be met with a chorus of silent but stern looks from his brothers. The unofficial penalty for accidental talking was an extra shift in the garden, or worse, having to listen to Brother Jerome's theories about the secret lives of monastery mice. Over time, most monks became so adept at silent communication that they could have entire conversations about the weather, the state of the turnip crop, and the latest monastery gossip, all without making a sound. After dinner, the monks would gather for a final prayer service called compline. This was the quietest part of the day, a time for reflection. And if you were Brother Francis for plotting your next attempt at brewing beer in the laundry room. The monks would file back to their dormitory, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of people who had mastered the art of not bumping into each other in the dark. Nighttime in the monastery was a study in tranquility. The only sounds were the distant hoot of an owl, the gentle creak of wooden beams, and the occasional snore from Brother Matthew, who had a reputation for falling asleep before his head hit the pillow. The vow of silence extended even into dreams, or so the monks liked to joke, though no one ever admitted to dreaming in sign language. And so, day after day, year after year, the silent monks survived and even thrived without speaking. They built a world where gestures, glances, and the occasional exaggerated eyebrow did the work of words. In the process, they discovered that sometimes saying nothing at all can be the most eloquent way to live. Of course, even the most disciplined silent monks had their moments of mischief. After all, when you spend years communicating with nothing but hand signals, you start to get creative, sometimes a little too creative. Practical jokes became a kind of unofficial sport in the monastery, and since no one could shout, "Surprise," or "Who did this to my sandals?", the pranks had to be subtle, silent, and ideally deniable. One classic involved swapping out the abbot's prayer book for a copy of Brother Jerome's treatise on the mysterious motivations of monastery mice. The abbot, a man of great patience but questionable eyesight, would open his book at morning prayers and find himself face to face with a detailed analysis of why the mice preferred the left side of the pantry. The only indication of the prank was the suppressed twitching of several monks' eyebrows and the faintest hint of a smile on Brother Francis's usually serious face. Another favourite was the mismatched sandals trick. Since all the sandals looked the same, it was easy to swap a left for a right or sneak a slightly smaller pair into someone's cubby. The victim would spend the day shuffling around trying to maintain an air of holy dignity while clearly wearing shoes that didn't fit. The only way to complain was through a series of increasingly dramatic sighs and mournful glances at one's feet, which only encouraged the pranksters. But the true masterpiece of monastic mischief was the silent echo. This involved waiting until a particularly serious moment, like the reading of the Rule of Saint Benedict, then subtly mimicking the abbot's gestures from the back row. If the abbot raised his hand, so did the prankster. If he scratched his nose, so did the prankster. The rest of the monks, sworn to silence but not to seriousness, would do their best not to laugh, which usually resulted in a room full of red-faced monks desperately pretending to cough or sneeze. Despite these moments of levity, the monks took their vow of silence seriously. It wasn't just about not talking, it was about listening to each other, to the world around them, and most importantly to the quiet voice of God. The silence created a space where thoughts could grow, where prayers could be heard, and where even the smallest gestures took on great meaning. But let's not pretend it was all spiritual enlightenment and peaceful contemplation. There were days when the silence felt less like a blessing and more like a test of endurance. Imagine trying to explain to Brother Peter that the soup was on fire, or to Brother Matthew that he was about to sit on a cat, all without uttering a word. Sometimes the only thing that saved the day was a well-timed gesture or a particularly expressive eyebrow. The monks also developed a kind of sixth sense for each other's moods. After years of living together in silence, they could tell when someone needed cheering up, when someone was deep in thought, or when someone was just hungry and hoping for an extra slice of bread. A sympathetic nod, a shared smile, or a quietly offered piece of cheese could say more than 1,000 words. Visitors to the monastery often marveled at this silent camaraderie. Some found it inspiring, Others found it baffling, and a few found it downright unsettling. One traveling merchant reportedly left after a single night, claiming he'd seen the monks talking with their eyes and wasn't sure if it was a miracle or a very quiet conspiracy. And yet, for all its oddities, the silent life worked. The monks managed to run a thriving community, produce some of the best beer and cheese in the region, and maintain a library that would make any scholar jealous, all without saying a word. Their days were filled with purpose, their nights with peace, and their lives with a kind of quiet joy that spoke louder than any sermon. As the years passed, the silent monks became experts in the art of non-verbal communication. They could organize a feast, settle a dispute, or plan a building project using nothing but hand signals and a few well-chosen glances. They even developed a silent version of charades for feast days, which was, according to Brother Francis, the highlight of the monastic social calendar. And so through storms and sunshine, laughter and prayer, the silent monks survived and even thrived without speaking for years. Their story is a reminder that sometimes the quietest voices have the most to say. Even the animals in the monastery seemed to pick up on the silent way of life. The monastery cats, for example, became masters at interpreting hand signals, especially the ones that meant off the table or out of the cheese. Brother Francis swore that the oldest cat, a grumpy tabby named Hildegard, could tell the difference between the sign for food and the sign for no. Really, that's not for you. The chickens, on the other hand, remained blissfully oblivious to all forms of communication, silent or otherwise, and continued their campaign of stealing breadcrumbs with reckless abandon. The monastery dog, a gentle hound named Benedict, was perhaps the most popular resident. He had learned to respond to a series of silent cues. A tap on the knee meant walk with me. A wave of the hand meant time for bed, and a slow blink meant good boy. Benedict, in turn, communicated his needs with soulful eyes and the occasional well-timed tail wag. He was especially good at comforting novices who struggled with the transition to silence, curling up beside them and offering the kind of wordless support that only a dog can give. Life in the monastery followed the rhythm of the seasons. In spring, the monks planted their gardens using silent teamwork to turn patches of earth into rows of vegetables. In summer, they harvested crops and gathered honey from the monastery's beehives, which required a whole new set of hand signals, mostly variations on "don't upset the bees." In autumn, they pressed apples for cider and prepared preserves for winter, all while communicating with the efficiency of a well-oiled, if slightly eccentric machine. Winter brought its own challenges. The cold stone walls of the monastery seemed to amplify every creak and groan, and the silence became even more profound. The monks wrapped themselves in extra layers, communicated with puffs of frosty breath, and found comfort in the warmth of the kitchen. Brother Marcus, who had a knack for baking, would produce loaves of bread so fragrant that even the vow of silence couldn't stop the appreciative smiles and eager hand gestures for just one more slice, please. The long winter evenings were spent in quiet companionship. Some monks read by candlelight, others worked on embroidery or wood carving, and a few brave souls attempted to teach the cats new tricks with limited success. The scriptorium became a haven of calm, where the only sounds were the scratch of quills on parchment and the occasional sneeze from Brother Matthew, who was allergic to dust, but refused to let that stop him from copying manuscripts. Feast days were a welcome break from the routine. While the vow of silence technically remained in place, the atmosphere was lighter, and the monks allowed themselves small indulgences. The kitchen would produce special dishes, the bakery would turn out sweet treats, and the refectory would be decorated with simple garlands. The highlight of the evening was always the silent charades tournament, where even the most reserved monks competed to see who could mime Jonah and the whale, or the miracle of the loaves and fishes, with the most flair. Despite the challenges, the monks found joy in their silent life. They discovered that laughter didn't need words, that friendship could be built on shared glances and inside jokes, and that sometimes the best conversations happened without a single sound. The vow of silence, far from being a burden, became a source of strength, a reminder that there are many ways to be heard and that sometimes the quietest voices carry the furthest. Visitors who stayed long enough often found themselves picking up the monks' habits. Merchants would leave the monastery unconsciously, using hand signals to haggle over prices, and pilgrims would return home with stories of the silent brothers who could communicate more with a look than most people could with a speech. The monks, for their part, took quiet pride in their reputation, knowing that their silent example spoke volumes. And so, through the changing seasons and the passing years, the silent monks continued their quiet journey, proving that you don't need words to build a community, to share a laugh, or to live a life filled with meaning. Sometimes the vow of silence led to misunderstandings that became legendary within the monastery walls. There was the famous incident of the Great Lentil Mix-Up, when Brother Peter's enthusiastic hand gesture for more lentils was misread as no lentils ever again. For an entire month, the kitchen produced meals suspiciously free of lentils, and Brother Peter grew increasingly desperate, resorting to elaborate pantomimes involving imaginary beans and pleading eyes. When the mistake was finally discovered, the resulting lentil feast was so grand that even the abbot cracked a rare, silent smile. Then there was the time Brother Matthew tried to warn everyone about a goose that had wandered into the chapel. His frantic flapping and honking impressions were so convincing that several monks thought he was experiencing a spiritual vision. The goose, meanwhile, strutted up and down the aisle completely unbothered before finally being ushered out with a combination of gentle gestures and a trail of breadcrumbs. For weeks afterward, the sign for unexpected goose became a running joke among the brothers. The vow of silence also made celebrations and special occasions uniquely memorable. On birthdays, the monks would surprise the celebrant with a silent procession carrying a loaf of sweet bread adorned with candles. The birthday monk would be treated to a chorus of silent gestures, waving hands, exaggerated bows, and the universal sign for many happy returns, which looked suspiciously like jazz hands. It was impossible not to feel loved, even without a single word being spoken. Monastic holidays were filled with their own traditions. On the feast of Saint Benedict, the monks would organize a silent scavenger hunt, leaving clues written in riddles and hidden in unexpected places. The final prize was usually something simple, a jar of honey, a new pair of sandals, or once a particularly handsome turnip from the garden, which Brother Francis insisted was the best prize of all. The laughter and camaraderie that filled the monastery on these days proved that joy didn't need a voice. Sometimes the silence was broken by necessity. Emergencies like a fire in the kitchen or a sudden illness required quick action and the occasional shouted warning. But even then, the monks reverted to silence as soon as the crisis was over, almost as if words were a precious resource to be used only when absolutely necessary. Over time, they became so attuned to each other's movements and moods that a raised eyebrow or a pointed finger could mobilize the entire community faster than any shouted command. The outside world often struggled to understand the monks' way of life. Letters from curious relatives would arrive filled with questions. How do you ask for help? How do you tell a joke? How do you say goodnight? The monks would reply with carefully written explanations, sometimes even including illustrated guides to their favorite hand signals. These letters became treasured keepsakes passed down through generations as proof that even the quietest lives could be filled with laughter and love. And of course, there were always the novices, the new monks who arrived full of questions and uncertainty. Their first weeks were a blur of confused gestures, accidental breaches of silence, and the occasional attempt to invent new signs on the spot. The older monks watched these efforts with gentle amusement, remembering their own early days of silent confusion. Over time, the novices learned to read the subtle language of the monastery, discovering that a shared smile or a helping hand could say more than any words. Through all these moments, funny, touching, and sometimes just plain odd, the silent monks built a life that was anything but boring. Their days were filled with purpose, their hearts with kindness, and their halls with the quiet music of a community that had learned to listen not just to each other, but to the world around them. As the years went by, the silent monks became local legends. Travelers passing through would often detour just to catch a glimpse of the brothers who never spoke, hoping to see one of their famous pantomime conversations in action. Some visitors tried to join in, usually with hilarious results, like the merchant who attempted to order cheese using what he thought was the sign for cheese, but was actually the monastery's signal for the abbot is coming. Look busy. The monks, ever patient, would respond with gentle smiles and the occasional corrective gesture, quietly amused by the confusion. The monks' reputation for silent wisdom grew, and people began to seek their advice on all sorts of matters. Local farmers would show up at the gate with a basket of apples and a series of frantic gestures about blight or stubborn cows. The monks, practiced in the art of non-verbal consulting, would listen carefully, nod sagely, and respond with a mixture of hand signals and helpful drawings in the dirt. Word spread that the silent monks could solve any problem as long as you were willing to play a little charades. Even other monasteries got in on the act. Once a year, monks from neighbouring abbeys would visit for a grand silent games competition. Events included speed-weeding silent relay races and the ever-popular Guess the Vegetable contest, where monks had to identify root crops by touch alone. The highlight was always the silent choir performance, where the monks would sing hymns using only hand movements and facial expressions. The audience, made up of monks and a handful of very confused chickens, would watch in rapt attention, occasionally bursting into silent applause, which looked a lot like enthusiastic jazz hands. Despite their fame, the monks never let it go to their heads. Life in the monastery remained humble and orderly. They still rose before dawn, still tended their gardens, and still baked enough bread to feed an army of hungry pilgrims. Their vow of silence was not just a quirky tradition, but a daily practice that shaped everything they did. It taught them patience, fostered creativity, and perhaps most importantly, gave them a deep appreciation for the little things like the sound of birdsong, the warmth of the sun, and the joy of a perfectly executed hand gesture. Sometimes the silence brought unexpected gifts. Brother Thomas, who had never considered himself particularly artistic, discovered a talent for drawing. Unable to explain his ideas with words, he began illustrating everything from garden plans to theological debates. His sketches became so popular that the abbot commissioned him to decorate the margins of the monastery's manuscripts with tiny whimsical drawings, frogs in habits, dancing turnips, and of course the occasional mischievous mouse. These illustrations became a beloved part of the monastery's legacy, a silent testament to the creativity that flourished in their quiet world. The vow of silence also deepened the monks' sense of community. Without words to distract them, they learned to truly see each other, to notice when someone was tired or worried or in need of a friend. A comforting hand on the shoulder, a shared loaf of bread, or a simple nod of understanding became powerful acts of kindness. The monks discovered that silence, far from isolating them, brought them closer together. And so the legend of the silent monks continued to grow. Their story travelled far beyond the monastery walls, inspiring poets, artists, and even the occasional wandering minstrel who, much to everyone's relief, was politely encouraged to play only instrumental music during his stay. Through it all, the monks remained true to their calling, living quietly, working diligently, and proving day after day that sometimes the most extraordinary lives are lived in the gentlest of whispers. As the seasons cycled on, the silent monks became experts in the subtle art of celebration. Their festivals were legendary, not because of loud music or raucous laughter, but because of the sheer inventiveness required to party without a peep. On feast days, the refectory would be decorated with garlands of herbs and wildflowers, and the kitchen would work overtime to produce delicacies like honey cakes, apple tarts, and Brother Marcus's famous surprise stew. The surprise being that no one ever figured out exactly what was in it. The highlight of every festival was the silent talent show. Monks would take turns performing skits, magic tricks, or even juggling acts, all without a single word. Brother Francis, who had a flair for the dramatic, once performed the entire story of Noah's Ark, using only bread rolls, cheese wheels, and a very patient monastery cat. The audience responded with waves of silent applause and the occasional tear of laughter, while the cat responded by stealing a cheese wheel and hiding under the abbot's chair. The monks also excelled at silent storytelling. At twilight, they'd gather in the cloister garden, where one brother would act out tales from scripture or local legend, using nothing but gestures, props, and the occasional borrowed chicken. The stories became more elaborate with each telling, and soon the monks had developed their own silent theatre company, complete with costumes made from old robes and hats fashioned from vegetable baskets. Even the most reserved monks found themselves drawn into the fun, playing everything from wise kings to mischievous foxes. But it wasn't all fun and games. The vow of silence was still the heart of their daily life, and sometimes the quiet felt heavy, especially for those missing family or struggling with doubt. On those days, the monks leaned on their silent brotherhood. A gentle pat on the back, a loaf of fresh bread left by a bedside, or a note written in careful script, these small acts of kindness spoke volumes. Over time, the monks learned that silence could be both a comfort and a challenge, a space for reflection and a test of patience. The outside world, meanwhile, continued to marvel at the monks' way of life. Pilgrims wrote home about the miracle of the silent feast, and local children dared each other to sneak peeks at the monks' legendary charades. Some visitors tried to adopt the vow of silence themselves, usually lasting about 15 minutes before bursting out with questions or laughter. The monks welcomed these efforts with understanding smiles, knowing that true silence was a skill honed over years, not minutes. Through it all, the monastery thrived. The gardens bloomed, the library grew, and the bakery's reputation spread far and wide. The monks' silent wisdom became a source of comfort for the surrounding villagers who came to see them not just as oddities, but as trusted neighbors and friends. And as the sun set each evening, the brothers would gather for one last silent prayer, grateful for another day spent together in peace. In the end, the silent monks proved that a life without words could be rich, joyful, and deeply connected. Their story became a gentle reminder to everyone inside and outside the monastery that sometimes the quietest voices carry the greatest wisdom, and that laughter, kindness, and community need no words at all. As time went on, the silent monks' legend quietly wove itself into the fabric of local folklore. Children would play monastery in the village square, communicating only with wild, exaggerated gestures and giggling fits, while their parents shook their heads and wondered if maybe, just maybe, a little more silence at home wouldn't be such a bad thing. Travellers carried tales of the monks' silent wisdom far and wide, stories of gardens that thrived on quiet care of cheese, so good it needed no introduction, and of a brotherhood that could organize a feast, solve a mystery, or stage a play, all without uttering a single word. The monks themselves, of course, remained blissfully unaware of their growing fame. Their days continued in the same gentle rhythm, waking before dawn, tending to their tasks, sharing silent meals, and gathering for prayer as the stars blinked awake overhead. New novices arrived wide-eyed and nervous, only to find themselves welcomed with silent grins and the universal sign for, "Don't worry, you'll get the hang of it." Old friends passed on, leaving behind well-worn sandals and cherished memories, while the next generation of monks picked up the thread of silent tradition. As the monastery aged, its walls grew thick with stories, some carved into the wood of the scriptorium desks, others painted in the margins of illuminated manuscripts, and many more passed along through the subtle language of glances and gestures. Brother Thomas's whimsical drawings became treasured heirlooms, and the annual silent games evolved into a beloved regional festival, drawing crowds from miles around to witness the world's quietest relay race and the now infamous vegetable charades. Even in the rare moments when the vow of silence was lifted during great celebrations or in times of crisis, the monks found themselves speaking softly, as if unwilling to disturb the peace they had so carefully cultivated. Words, when they came, felt precious and rare, like the first snow of winter or the last apple of the harvest. And when the silence returned, it was welcomed like an old friend, wrapping the monastery in a gentle hush that seemed to make the world itself slow down and listen. In the end, the monks' greatest legacy wasn't their cheese, their beer, or even their silent charades, though those were certainly impressive. It was the simple, profound lesson they offered to anyone willing to pay attention, that in a noisy world there is magic in quiet, that true understanding doesn't always need words, and that sometimes the best way to be heard is simply to listen. So if you ever find yourself in a quiet place, surrounded by the soft shuffle of sandals and the gentle rustle of robes, remember the silent monks. Maybe try a hand gesture or two. And above all, enjoy the peace, because sometimes the most extraordinary stories are told in silence.